All right. Well, hello, everybody. And I apologize that, of course, my camera is not working. But my name is How Hagedorn. I'm the Associate Director for the Transportation Research and Education Center. And I will be introducing and moderating today's Friday Transportation Seminar. Our Friday transportation seminars have been a tradition since 2000. These seminars are usually held live on Portland State University's urban campus that is located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Clackamas, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. For us, it is really important to acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place and remember these communities, as well as honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. Of course, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, today's seminar will be hosted fully online. Today, we are really pleased that we have three speakers from the Multnomah County Health Department. The first is Tamika Brazil. She is the principal investigator of Multnomah County's REACH program. She holds a Master of Business Administration and has a background in the private healthcare sector, as well as over 15 years at the Multnomah County Health Department. We also have Brendan Haggerty. He is the program coordinator for the Multnomah County Climate and Health Program. He holds the Master's in Urban and Regional Planning from PSU and has worked in public health for 10 years. And last but certainly not least is Charlene McGee, who is the program manager for Multnomah County's REACH program. She holds an executive master's in public administration from PSU and has over 15 years experience working at the intersection of public health and healthcare systems. And today they'll be talking about the Multnomah County REACH Transportation Crash and Safety Report at the intersection of transportation, health, race, and justice. So before jumping into the seminar, I'd like you to know about some of our upcoming seminars. Next week, we have a seminar that focuses on forging equity in cities using equitable transportation-oriented development as a blueprint for policy and practice. On March 19th, we have a seminar that looks at the evaluation of a transportation incentive program for affordable housing residents. On April 2nd, we have a webinar that focuses on racial bias and driver yielding behavior at crosswalks. This is actually a great follow-up seminar to what you will be hearing today. And then on May 7th, we are hosting a webinar that looks at the impacts of gentrification on transportation and social support for Black working poor families in Portland, Oregon. And this is research that was conducted by a PhD student here at Portland State University. As an overview of today's seminar, just wanted to go over a few things. You can expect our speakers to present for about 40 to 45 minutes, followed by a question and answer session. We will be receiving the questions through the questions feature on your control panel, as you can see on the screen. If we run out of time for all of your questions, we will give our speakers the opportunity to email written responses for any questions left unanswered. We will be recording today's webinar. It will be available on our website later today, along with the presentation slides. And lastly, if you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. With that, I will hand it over to our presenters.
Okay, thank you. So again, my name is Tamika Brazil, and I work as the Director of Chronic Disease Prevention and Health Promotion with Multnomah County's Health Department. And we appreciate you all having us today. We're really excited to share, as well as raise awareness and a call to action as it relates to transportation safety here in Multnomah County. Next slide, please. So before we get started, I must acknowledge that the data you'll be hearing today in the presentation from the report, it represents real people, members of our community. These are individuals who are sisters, brothers, mothers, fathers, and friends. And unfortunately, my In 2017, my daughter and granddaughter were in a serious traffic car crash. Both of them had to get multiple surgeries, and my daughter had to learn to rewalk. And even more recently, and since COVID, 2 colleagues have lost loved ones to fatal traffic car accidents. So this is a real issue, and we are no way wanting to place the blame on individuals. Rather, we would like to really take a look and examine the biases, systems, and spaces in the built environment. Look to those things versus the individuals. Next slide, please. So here's the roadmap outlining how we'll spend our time together. I'll start with a bit of context setting and making the connection between transportation and public health, transportation's impact on health, and the ability to access essential services. We'll share the methodology and report findings, discuss impacts of traffic fatalities, traffic injuries, and bias enforcement. You'll learn about our REACH program's physical activity strategy and some more exciting work that we have ahead. And then we'll be sharing out the recommendations. Next slide, please. So this slide provides an overview of one of the tools we use to provide our work. We use the plans based on this model here, which will paint a picture of why transportation is a public health issue. On the left side, you'll see questions that represent the who, the what, the why, and the how we do our work. The center provides the purpose, and on the right, you'll see key strategies. So overall, our chronic disease prevention and health promotion unit works to reduce the occurrence of Multnomah County's leading causes of death by creating community contexts that promote health and protect against preventable injury and chronic disease. Our work aims to change social, economic, and physical conditions as well as behaviors, which account for 80% of health outcomes. These changes occur at the population level, and by interrupting major factors that shape health outcomes on a larger scale, we can help and contribute to moving the dial. Our efforts center communication, policy, system, and environmental change strategies. In our development of these, we center and apply an equity lens. Health and equity should be on the forefront of the development and not an afterthought. I'll use transportation as an example since that's the topic for today. A racial equity lens in transportation planning allows us to ask about and understand the many factors that influence whether people walk or bike to ensure that we correct historic injustices. We aim to make system changes that reinforce accountability and environmental changes that alter physical spaces and the built environment. In partnership with the community, we develop communications that center the experiences, images, and voices of those most impacted. Relying on the science and data, our impact on population health is maximized by focusing on those who most experience adverse health outcomes, and design initiatives that are place-based and culturally specific. We know that Blacks, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, Native, Alaskan Native, immigrants, refugees, Indigenous, and other people of color are living and dying from the leading causes of death at higher rates than whites. So we engage community and honor community wisdom. Again, achieving health equity and chronic disease prevention requires that we engage with communities most impacted by the inequities. We empower these communities to respond to specific challenges in their social, cultural, and physical environments, increasing control over the factors that shape their lives. Health disparities among these populations are rooted in the fabrics shaped by structural racism. Our work is important in that it aims to advance health equity and heal traumas. We lead explicitly, though not exclusively, with race because racial inequities persist in every system across the country without exception. This includes health, education, criminal justice, employment, and so on. There is not one example of a system where there are no racial disparities in outcomes. We lead with race because when you look within other dimensions of identity, such as income, gender, sexuality, education, ability, age, citizenship, and geography, there are inequities based on race. Next slide, please. So this slide is just intended to reiterate chronic diseases and injuries are yanking down our life expectancy and are no longer diseases of those older in age. We continue to see younger folks who are living with and are dying from chronic disease. COVID has certainly exacerbated these issues. Next slide, please. So here you'll see Multnomah County's 10 leading causes of death. Connecting the dots here between transportation and the impacts of health. Our transportation investment choices influence health through 3 primary pathways: physical activity, crashes, and exposure to harmful air pollutants. Health costs associated with traffic crashes, air pollution, and physical inactivity add up to hundreds of billions of dollars each year. Yet, health is typically not considered in transportation planning and policy. We know that walkable, bikeable, transit-oriented communities are associated with healthier populations. People in such communities are more physically active, have less weight gain, have lower rates of traffic injuries, and are less exposed to air pollution. Transportation is a key social determinant of health and can be harmful to our health, but it doesn't have to be. Unsafe conditions result in adverse health outcomes by themselves, but they also create a barrier to physical activity. Again, this visual is intended to illustrate connections between our leading causes of death here in Multnomah County. By redressing transportation plans and policies throughout our communities, we can begin to move the dial on health. Next slide, please. So the previous slide linked transportation to injury and disease. And this last slide, borrowed from our friends at Metro Orlando, connects transportation to essential supports and services. Transportation policy is health policy. The visual shows us how transportation links and intersects within and throughout varying health-related issues and destinations. These are the ingredients to maintaining quality of life. Taking a holistic approach to transportation planning improves quality of life and promotes better health for everyone. Transportation infrastructure shapes access to jobs, education, food, mental health services, and other health supporting resources in community spaces. As an example, by considering the location of food access points like grocery stores and food pantries and how folks travel to and from these areas, we can make sure that active transportation networks serves connections to these health supporting destinations, making it easier for folks to access things as simple as healthy food options. Along with jobs, education, and food, transportation also falls under Multnomah County's priority number 4 within the Community Health Plan's list of essential services. Transportation in all policies is an approach to public policies across sectors, systematically taking into account the health implications or decisions, seeking synergies, and avoiding harmful health impacts in order to achieve population health and health equity. I'll now turn it over to my colleague Brendan to talk and lean into the report. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Tamika. So what we want to share today is the findings of a report that we've been working on for quite some time that describes the conditions for the Black population of Multnomah County as they move around the transportation system. One of the main reasons we did this was to provide a baseline that we can use to help measure progress towards transportation equity, recognizing that unsafe conditions create a barrier to making healthy choices. We defined that baseline in terms of 6 categories based on what we heard from our own team and from our community partners. And as we did that, we very consciously tried to expand the definition of transportation safety beyond the conventional metrics of fatal and severe injuries in an attempt to encompass experiences people have in the right of way that cause concern for their safety and might be influencing the choices they make or the choices available to them. These are the 6 categories we use. I'm going to walk through the findings for each category. But first, I'll share a little bit about our methods and data sources. We used a mixture of methods and data sources to provide as complete of a picture as we could. Some of these are really traditional public health tools, like analysis of death records and emergency department visit data. And I'll point out that this is a little bit different from many transportation safety reports you might come across, which tend to use law enforcement crash reports or Department of Transportation crash reports. This is instead drawing on official death certificates through our public health vital records. So we also used some less commonly accessed data sources in public health, including law enforcement data from the local jurisdictions in Multnomah County and our own Public Safety Coordinating Council. We also drew from non-governmental organizations and from research literature, some of which will be covered in transportation seminars later this year. So the first safety outcome we looked at was fatal injury. And certainly the headline from this report is that the death rate from traffic crash injuries among the county's Black population is much higher than that of the non-Hispanic white population. We looked at the 5-year period of 2013 through 2017 and found that the death rate for Black residents was nearly double that for white residents. And this is a statistically significant difference. In the report, we also looked at the previous 5-year period and found that the disparity grew over that combined 10-year period. The second outcome we looked at was non-fatal injuries. And before I get into that, I'll stop here and just give credit to my colleagues in our epidemiology services team who developed this map of years of potential life lost from fatal crashes in Multnomah County. And this is by census defined PUMAs or public use microdata areas. But what it shows is that the cumulative burden from traffic crash deaths normalized for population is about twice the rate in East Portland and East County as it is on the west side of the Willamette and in inner East Portland. When we looked at non-fatal injury, we used emergency department and urgent care clinic visits to evaluate transportation crash injuries. And we found evidence that was suggestive of overrepresentation among the county's Black population. That group accounted for 17% of visits, but depending on how you categorize race, they're less than 8% of the county's population. To provide further context on non-fatal injuries, we used an analysis that Metro conducted to identify the corridors with the highest injury incidence in the region. They did that using crash reports from law enforcement and Oregon Department of Transportation. And we compared those high injury corridors to the census tracts where the REACH program focuses our efforts. And those census tracts are home to a higher proportion of Black and African American, African immigrant and refugee population, and also have a higher poverty rate than the rest of the county. Our finding was that 77% of the total length of those corridors in the county passes through or along these tracts. And that's pretty important because in some parts of the county, the street grid or the street network is quite a lot different from what we experience in inner Portland. And when we look at eastern parts of the county, we see that there are disconnections and incompleteness in the sidewalk network that essentially cause you to be on the large, fast-moving arterials to get anywhere, to get between any set of destinations and origins. So this highlights the dynamic that emerges if people are displaced from one neighborhood to another and the exposures they might face for injury. The third outcome was biased behavior among road users. And by this, we mean behaviors that occur during travel, mostly in the small ways we use the rules of the road to accommodate each other or not as we move around. And to understand this, we relied on a report from the city of Portland. In the preparation for their recent pedestrian plan update, the city conducted surveys and focus groups with the Black population and published the results in a report called Walking While Black. That report demonstrates a lot of insights about biased behavior among road users, and you can see excerpts here. This qualitative information and analysis from the city was also matched by studies from PSU comparing wait times for Black and white pedestrians to cross the street. And they did find that Black men had to wait for twice as many cars and waited 32% longer. The fourth outcome we looked at was biased policing. The report discusses a recent study of 100 million traffic stops nationwide, which found that Black motorists were 20% more likely than white to be stopped by the police. This resonated with local experiences. The Walking While Black report found higher rates of police stops among the Black population. Our report also cites some of the work of the Multnomah County Public Safety Coordinating Council, which shows disparities along racial lines once people interact with the justice system. The fifth outcome we looked at was harassment. When we looked at data on bias crimes published by the Portland Police Bureau, we found that anti-Black or anti-African American was the most common category for bias crimes, accounting for 21% of the total. In those incidents, offenders were mostly white, mostly male, and often a stranger. These data are from Portland Police Bureau, but we know there's a lot of potential underreporting. So we also drew on data from the Portland United Against Hate Project, where people can report details of hate incidents. In its initial set of data, the Portland United Against Hate effort found that Black people were the victims in 13% of reported incidents. The final outcome we looked at was violent crime. In the report, we map incidents of violent crime to make the simple point that the danger of violence is unevenly distributed across the county. And in some neighborhoods, it's a strong influence on people's travel choices or their ability to be active outside. But where people live is just part of the story, since we all move around the region a lot to meet our daily needs. And what the Walking While Black report found is that violent bias crimes, even a few of them, can loom large in people's minds as they choose how to move around the county. So incidents like the Max stabbing or the murder of Larnell Bruce cast a long shadow. That can be pretty hard to quantify, but we have tried to document that it's affecting people's choices in the Black community. So if you download and read the report from the health department's website, you'll find that data stops at about the year 2018. And that is in part because we pulled this report together and had it pretty much ready to go a year ago and had to pause that on account of the pandemic. So I wanted to quickly walk through a few updates to the data that have become available since then. And I'll do that for each of the categories. So adding an additional year of data shows that the disparity in the Black-white disparity in traffic crash injury deaths is maintained. It is essentially unchanged. And we can see in a report released by the city of Portland today that 2020 was a particularly deadly year on Portland roads, and that's true across the county as well. The preliminary data show about 80 deaths in Multnomah County, which is far above the 2016 through 2019 average, which was below 60. For non-fatal injuries, it was a very unusual year where we saw emergency department and urgent care clinic visits for traffic crash injuries decline markedly at the beginning of the pandemic and then gradually return to normal levels, only to fall again during the wildfire smoke events in September. For bias policing, we found new reports from Campaign Zero that found that Black Portlanders were arrested at a rate 4.3 times higher than whites. And the Multnomah County Local Public Safety Coordinating Council similarly found that disparities in jailing and arrests had increased for Black residents between 2014 and 2019. Portland United Against Hate has documented hundreds more hate incidents. If we looked at the data for the most recent reporting period of April through July and saw that streets and sidewalks continue to be the most common location, and that race and ethnicity are the most commonly cited motivations. And then finally, for violent crime, Portland police data for 2020 reflect a sharp increase in shooting incidents. From July 2020 through January of this year, the monthly average number of shooting incidents was nearly 3 times the monthly average for the preceding 18 months. So taken together, this set of findings reflects strong influences on feelings of safety in the right of way, and they illustrate how concern for physical safety pairs with concern about violence and biased behavior to create barriers to active and healthy choices. We're providing these data as a baseline that the county and other agencies can use to help measure progress toward a more equitable transportation system. Now I'll pass it to Charlene to describe how we plan to do that.
Thanks, Brendan and Ms. Tamika. So one of the things we know that's also important to talk about are the health impacts of traffic fatalities and injury and safety in the public right of way. We know that with traffic injuries and fatalities, there are a number of ramifications. Traffic crashes and injuries are a public health problem and a preventable one. One with burden that manifests itself in multiple ways, including mortality, injuries, and economic impact, and certainly the human impact to society. While we know that economic impact is notable, we also know that there's cost that's associated with medical care and productivity loss of income as well. We know that with loss of income, family feels that in multiple ways. We know that support systems are also impacted by this. So when we do talk about traffic fatalities and injuries, we recognize this as a public health crisis because it ties into multiple social determinants of health. So traffic crashes, traffic injury, harassment, and bias police, both by law enforcement and by citizens, can be traumatizing. Truth is, you never are truly prepared for the emotional or psychological impact. Those at times also create long-term impact. The mental and emotional injuries after a car crash can include mental anguish, emotional distress, fear, anger, humiliation, anxiety, shock, embarrassment, as well as random loss of crying and just other emotions. We also cannot forget the psychological impact for those directly and indirectly affected. We also have to acknowledge the impact on dedicated emergency crews, as well as police and medical professionals and public health and transportation professionals who are analyzing and reporting on that data. Next slide, please. We know that so every third Sunday in November, It's World Day of Remembrance for road traffic victims. While we seek to acknowledge and recognize the millions of lives lost due to traffic crashes nationally, we know that that happens in different ways as well. We know that the media bring to light the tragic events, but we also know that behind the names and the numbers are true family and friends. We know that families and community lives have forever been changed and impacted. We also want to recognize and acknowledge the victims as well. We know that there are families and members of our community who are woven into many ways into what keeps and sustains us. We also know that with the language that is used to portray and talk about traffic crashes, we know that language matters. We have to humanize the victims and the survivors of traffic and pedestrian fatalities. We have to identify them as humans, and we have to remember them, and also note that their deaths are not isolated incidents, that their deaths are linked to larger systemic health and safety issues. Next slide, please. This slide and the next one represent headlines from both local and national news. I also just want to call out and recognize that today would have been Trayvon Martin's 26th birthday. Actually, no, sorry, February 5th would have been his 26th birthday, and that today he was murdered 9 years ago. And also this week on February 23rd, also marked the 1-year death anniversary of Ahmaud Arbery. These are two examples of Black men being killed in the right of way. And we know that the impact of their death has a ripple effect around ongoing efforts to promote active transportation and to encourage Black bodies to engage in physical activity. That these headlines are backdrops and reminders that deter and discourage community from engaging in health and engaging in physical activity. For research continues to show that engaging in increased physical activity decreases one risk of chronic disease. Next slide, please. While headlines and data are released, we know that there's an impact that occurs in toxic stress. We know that with our data year, both locally and nationally, that toxic stress contributes to chronic disease disparities. As Brendan spoke about, I think it's also important to note that Portland, through the recent report by Campaign Zero, has been recognized as the city with the 5th worst in the country around this data. And we know that when we hear data about Black people being killed, we know that there are impacts to our health as well. We hear from our community repeatedly about the concerns. Am I next? Could I be next? Could I be the next hashtag? Personally, as a mother to a 12-year-old Black son, I feel that same anxiety. When all he simply wants to go and do is ride on his bike, I recognize that his mere presence of being in the streets could result in his death. And next slide, please. And next slide. So one of the things that's critical to the REACH work is that in addition to different campaigns, in addition to our campaigns, we also are intentional about identifying policy systems and environmental change. Because as Representative Ayanna Pressley said, policy is our law of language. We know that with policy, we can create and sustain change. So through our various interventions, the ultimate outcome of each of these are really tied into bigger policy systems and environmental work. Over the next year, we will continue to do different initiatives. We'll continue to lead different initiatives, including our Prescribe a Bike program, a partnership with Portland Bureau of Transportation, where we will be piloting a concept about prescribing bikes as a means of addressing chronic disease disparities. However, also what's important to note with that is that we are embedding safety as part of that efforts. Additionally, we will be rolling out this year or early spring, Active People, Healthy Nation, a national campaign that we will adapt and call Active People, Healthy Multnomah County, where we will be encouraging community members to engage in 150 minutes of physical activity per day. Also, through our work with Healthy Regions Planning and Exchange, we're convening together regional partners to address health inequities within the right-of-way. And also, we will continue to roll out the Reach Traffic Safety Report in spaces with decision makers, planners, and engineers to continue to promote and share our recommendations. Next slide, please. This slide represents our agreement and our language from CDC. This is the work that we're doing under our physical activity and built environment strategy area. As you note in red, one of the key deliverables is actually the release of this report, providing recommendations to address the increase, the disparities that are noted in our traffic fatalities and injuries within the city. We know that when we fail to design systems to move people, people end up hurt and end up being killed. We know that the built environment and transportation are key social determinants of health. And we know that transportation remains a civil rights issue. Both transportation and the built environment are connected to numerous social inequities, such as poverty, employment, access to equal opportunities. And we also know what's central to a lot of this work remains safety. Next slide, please. We know that the cost of health inequities, we know that there's associated costs with health inequities. Failing to address them have both economic, we know that failing to address them will have an economic impact. The slide that you're viewing shows the various ways in which the system and all of us are paying for health inequities. We see that, the failing to do so, the estimated economic burden of health inequities is $442 million. The cost of premature mortality is $332 million. And indirect cost and care is at $92 million, while indirect cost of illness is $18 million. Next slide, please. So you've heard and you've seen the data. We invite you as partners into our work. We invite you to consider how health equity and how health policy and how embedding racial equity into your long-term work can and create a more livable built environment and transportation system for our community. Through all our efforts and through partners, both internal and external, we remain committed to identifying communications campaign, as well as identifying, designing, and implementing policy systems and environmental change. This report includes our policy systems and environmental change recommendation that we are asking, and at times also demanding, you to see this as a call to action and to see this as an action step for you to consider to join us in our efforts of developing sustainable change. We acknowledge the fear urgency of now and realize the power of policy systems and environmental change to address the noted disparities. I will turn it over to Brandon to walk us through the identified policy and associated rationale. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlene. So if you download our report, you'll find recommendations sorted into these 4 categories. And the communication campaign piece is focused on centering the Black experience that we've discussed today, that is reflected in the report. For policy change strategies, this is kind of an issue of what gets counted counts. And what we're recommending is that agencies establish a policy of establishing measurable equity goals and then routinely evaluating them and institutionalizing that. similarly make it a policy to practice authentic community engagement with communities of color. The report discusses systems change, and we suggest collaborating with public health. And this report is one way of inviting that, to analyze safety data, to disaggregate it by race, and to assess progress on racial equity goals. The report includes some more detailed recommendations on authentic community engagement that include conducting accessible planning and engagement activities on a realistic timeline and in realistic locations, and compensating community members and organizations for their expertise. And then finally, we discuss environmental strategies. And those are some of the things that get talked about regularly in this seminar. But we're recommending the use of scientifically supported infrastructure changes like traffic calming, speed control, and mode separation to reduce injuries. We recommend prioritizing those improvements with neighborhoods with a high proportion of Black residents. And we further recommend enhancing feelings of safety and belonging by investing in artwork, street name changes, and cultural events in the right of way. So with that, I encourage folks to visit our website and find the full report, and we can move into questions and answers.
Great. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. And I really appreciate the way you frame the 6 dimensions of transportation safety. I think that's really helpful for transportation professionals to look at that and say, okay, these are the 6 dimensions. And then to also frame the strategies and actions into 3 different categories, the policy systems and environmental strategies. So one question that I have is, within the report, one of the policy strategies that you've identified is the use of a health impact assessment to evaluate and measure the impact of decisions that specifically affect communities who are the most burdened. How do we move towards institutionalizing this? And do you have an example of one that has been recently completed for a transportation project?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's something that we can be including for major projects in the same environmental evaluation stage that those go through. An example of that recently is the earthquake-ready Burnside Bridge replacement project, for which we completed a health impact assessment. For smaller projects, I think there's a need for a lighter and more nimble touch. And I think that's one of the reasons that we're advising as a system strategy to collaborate regularly with public health, so that we can hopefully provide that for the transportation agencies operating in Multnomah County. I think one of the things that we're very much aware of in this report is that Multnomah County itself is not a big operator of a large part of the transportation system in the county. Most of the streets are owned and managed by cities. And obviously our transit infrastructure is mostly managed by TriMet and Portland Streetcar. So in some ways, this is an offer of an invitation to collaborate on those kinds of analyses.
Great, thanks. And this sort of connects with that because I think this was mentioned in one of the policy strategies, and maybe Charlene or Tamika can also weigh in on this too, is from your perspective, what constitutes authentic community engagement beyond the existing channels?
For us, we have, just a number of community partners that we've built and cultivated relationships with over the years. And so when we do have different issues and decisions that need to be made, we can easily call on someone and count on someone from the community to be at the table and to help support, engage, and develop the various initiatives that we have. Most recently, just an example, around our COVID vaccination response, we've had an overwhelming res- um, response and interest from varying community members and community organizations to just asking, what is it that we can do? How can we help you in the work plans? How can we help you in spreading and disseminating information and communications and things of that nature? And so just kind of, bringing the community along as we go, sharing different terminology and concepts and definitions. I know we've had a transportation academy trying to reach the community in that way to help them be better informed as it relates to transportation.
Yeah, I mean, and I think in addition to that too, I think a lot of the plans that are being rolled out currently, right, are sort of going around this timeline. And, I've heard from planners or engineers who say, we've been working on this for the last 15, 20 years. And then I'm like, are you really trying to engage the community right now? Right? Because if you have something that's been in the pipeline for the last 15 and 20 years, and you're asking the community to give feedback, are you really going to listen to them and incorporate their changes into, this length of plan? So I use as an example, one, right? Because I think if we're talking about really true community engagement, it's really thinking about the community, is making sure that the community voice, the ideas and perspectives that you're soliciting will show up, right, in the work that you're looking to do. I also think, authentic community engagement looks like, really being transparent and open with the community to say, we're this far along in the plan, your ideas will inform, right, this way. And these are sort of like the ideas of things in terms of what we can do to be flexible as we're rolling out different projects. And I think lastly, it's just important to note, if we're really talking about true, authentic community engagement, is thinking about the community at the beginning of the project and throughout the project, right? But not at the end, or, a project has started that didn't really engage the community and the community heard about it. And now they're making demands, right, to make sure that they're heard.
That's great. And then along those lines, I think there's a follow-up question that relates to that. And it asks for, do you have any specific recommendations for inclusive ways to engage the community? So more of, are there specific strategies to be more inclusive?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me too, when I thinking about that question, I think again, I think really thinking about the continuum of engagement. I think thinking about how are you tapping into existing community networks? How are you tapping into existing community coalition? I think, I think again, the community, especially that have been impacted around displacement and urban development, people are really seeing a lot of this work through a different lens. And I think if we're really talking about keeping people invested, and I think showing up at the table that we're asking them, we have to think about, what are the times of the days you're holding these meetings? When are you holding it? When you're planning these meetings, are they conflicting with existing standing community, community efforts that are also going on? And I think too, right, part of the concept on why we've done the Reach Transportation Academy, it's also helping to break down just to break all of this down. I know when I started with the Reach program, I remember several times I would text Brandon or emails on like, what are they talking about and what does this even mean, right? I think sometimes breaking down these complex terminology to help the community to even understand and not assume that, we all know what active transportation means, because we don't if you're not in the field or in that, or not in that body of work.
Yeah, there is a lot of jargon in transportation that's really difficult to navigate.
I'm like, we're public health professionals, but I'm not a transportation.
And I just wanted to add, you also mentioned in your report that a way to be more inclusive is also to compensate. So I think
Absolutely. We think it's important to compensate the community for their time and their expertise.
Okay, so I'm going to pivot. There are quite a few questions that have come in. This one is around funding decisions. So how are health departments mobilizing as funding decisions are made at federal, state, and local levels for transportation projects? Who are the most influential health officers, and where are they representing these health perspectives in transportation spaces?
I would say the short answer is that we're not right now. There's a pandemic and it takes almost all of our bandwidth. But typically health departments are not especially engaged in funding decisions at the state and federal level directly. The organizations that represent the public health as a discipline are engaged in those discussions. So the National Association of County and City Health Officials and the American Public Health Association both participate in those and partner with groups like the American Planning Association to comment on funding decisions. I don't know if Charlene or Tamika, if either of you have anything to add.
I mean, I think to your point, we really are not. I think there's opportunity, I think, with probably some of the recent appointees. I think with Department of Transportation, I think I can think about. I think we're starting to see the connection between health and transportation, but I can't really think of anything that explicit or beyond what Brandon has spoken to.
Yeah, it's probably a good reminder that post-COVID, when the resources are less tapped to actually deal with this pandemic, that hopefully public health officials are ready to re-engage on transportation projects.
I think what I'll say, I think post-COVID, there will definitely be bandwidth to engage more with transportation. However, I think there's also important to note that we still have a lot of opportunity with COVID. As we've been planning different COVID vaccine clinic, one of the key barriers that the community continues to experience is transportation. How are we getting people safely to and from, existing, working with, for us, we work with PBOT, Portland Bureau of Transportation, to help with like traffic management of the roadway. So I think, yes, post-COVID, there's definitely ample opportunities, but we definitely have a lot of opportunities now.
Great. And so this also kind of relates to the funding question. This person is energized by a somewhat more positive outlook for more funding for state pedestrian and bicycle projects. While we celebrate that incremental progress, how can we achieve better outcomes for health and environment without reducing massive investments in harmful infrastructure? And I think they followed it up with, how can people and health departments in Oregon effectively escalate the urgency of sustainable investment and reduce investments in the systems that harm, for example, police, highways, etc.?
I love that question. Oh, you can go, Ms. Tamika.
I was just going to say, one of the things that I continue to talk about and share out is that this is an all hands on deck approach. While public health and transportation agencies are at the forefront of this issue at hand, it's really, we need the capacity since COVID, especially, we're way above water. And so just really looking to other partners that not normally and traditionally see themselves in this realm of work, looking again to get and solicit support from folks that are not necessarily engaged in the health aspect, but to get them to understand. So this is one of the tools, these road shows, kind of sharing out information like this to get them to understand the importance of it and the need for making changes throughout our systems.
Did you have anything to add, Charlene or Brendan?
I might add to that I think that highlighting the connections between climate change and health is an effective way that health departments are accomplishing that. And we've seen that locally with analysis of the Metro Climate Smart Strategy showing really, really large benefits from increased physical activity and decreased air pollution. We see that happening now at the state level under the governor's executive order and analysis of climate and health impacts from the Oregon Health Authority and from the Department of Environmental Quality. And I think what's relevant to this report about that is that it spotlights some of the same groups that we see as experiencing a disproportionate burden from unsafe conditions on the road.
And I think adding to what my colleagues have spoke about, I think also, in public health, we talk about social determinants of health. I think looking at social determinants of health, looking at health department data or the areas that you're in, when we look at social vulnerability data, we're seeing that literally when you overlap, right, COVID numbers with existing county 10 leading causes of death in places where we have traffic, injuries and fatalities, they are literally occurring in the same area. Like none of the disparities that we're talking about are separate. And I think really thinking about this holistic view and approach to development and transportation and planning is critical.
So basically what you're saying is we know those areas that are suffering the most, right, Charlene? And we should be focusing in on those areas.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll go back to even when we talk about COVID planning, Ms. Tamika and I were talking this morning, because again, we're looking at ongoing COVID response. And, we have to be mindful about the locations that we're placing the COVID vaccine sites, right? And we also looked at that around our COVID vaccine testing, the COVID testing as well, because we know that people are experiencing coming to those sites. There are barriers getting there safely. You have to make sure public transportation, or you just have to factor in all these different things. None of the disparities that we're talking about are isolated. Even I think if you look at educational outcomes, it ties back into our chronic disease data as well. And the same also can be said for violence data.
Okay, so related to this, and I think it's been touched on a little bit throughout the presentation, but what steps is Multnomah County taking with municipal transportation agencies who have Vision Zero goals to meet the road safety, traffic safety issues?
I think for us, I think as it relates to the REACH grant in this report, there's work underway. There are work on the horizon and additional opportunities that we continue to explore and hope to share more in the future. But, I think we're definitely, I think also responding to that question, I think really, we're realizing the opportunity that we have with the increased learning over the years. And Multnomah County, as well as other entities, we're definitely trying to make strides to adjust and change our systems to respond to what we're seeing and we know needs to happen.
Great. So there is one last question, and I think it has a sort of a legal bent, knowing who asked the question. It says, I am mindful of the effects of fatal and serious injury crashes on the involved drivers. Some of them face fines, legal bills, and/or incarceration. Have you considered how to include, evaluate, and communicate about the extent and nature of those impacts as additive burdens and trauma on individuals, families, and communities? It's a really good question.
It is. I want to say yes. I know Brennan and I have talked about, sort of how the impact of traffic fines and fees are having on community. I think it was in the last session, there were some efforts around I can't remember specifically, it was like something around like traffic fines. And I know like we supported or give some analysis, we provided some analysis and impact around those. So I would definitely say I think that's actually a great question. I would definitely want us to hold on to and figure out how do we continue, like if there's ways for us to embed some of that into our ongoing policy recommendations to explore.
Great. And actually, I do have one last question. It's a
And I
burning
think Brandon
question.
was going to ask.
Okay,
Brandon was
go
going to
ahead.
add to that.
Go
Sorry.
ahead. Go ahead, Brendan.
I'll just say briefly that it's definitely something that we struggle with, and perhaps nowhere more than in the context of the discussion about automated enforcement, the use of speed cameras and red light cameras. And ideally those citations would be enough to dissuade that dangerous behavior, but not so much that it forces someone to make a difficult decision about medication versus rent, right?
Yeah. Great, thanks. So I know that we're 2 minutes over time, but this is sort of a burning question I have. And I think it traces back to sort of the racist history of in Oregon. And that's why the number of Black people and other people of color are so low. And one of the points that Brendan made in the presentation was we need to disaggregate data. How do we disaggregate when the numbers are so low?
I think to that, I think part of what can be helpful in all systems is to just even start to collect the data, right? Because then over time you will start to see that increase. I think, and I think for me, one of the things I'm just always cautious of too about saying our numbers are so low, because I think it's important to acknowledge the history, but it's also to recognize the volume of us that are here, and to also talk about, the importance of the critical mass so that the numbers can show up to be statistically significant. But I think starting to collect the data, I think, and I think with the numbers even being low, I think we also can look at other communities of color, right, where we can account for those communities because their numbers are statistically significant to help to, respond to other community issues and challenges. Because I think one of the opportunities that the REACH program affords is that although our program priority population are Black and African immigrant and refugees, the recommendations that we're proposing supports all other communities of color, as well as the general population within Multnomah County.
Great. Tamika and Brendan, any last words before I close up? And I apologize to the audience for going over. Great. Thank you so much. This was a great webinar. I learned a lot of information. We all learned a lot of information from it. So this concludes our Friday seminar. After the seminar ends, you'll have the opportunity to complete a brief survey. It only takes a few minutes, and we would really appreciate your feedback on this event. Thank you for joining us today, and have a great weekend.